What's up, Steve? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Um, all right, so we're going to talk about MMMs today for a second time, because we had someone reach out to us recently asking about how they should evaluate some MMM vendors and and how we think about it. So if you have not already watched our video about what goes into an MMM, if you don't really know what an MMM is, I think you just do this, boom, and now it's going to show up there, and you can click that and go watch it. Um, but otherwise, if you feel pretty well versed in MMOs, at least conceptually, then today we're gonna talk about why we're different, what we think matters, some of the stuff that bells and whistles that we think actually doesn't matter, but you're being sold and told it does, all that kind of good stuff. Um, yeah, where do you want to start, Steve?
Yeah, well, I think as you mentioned, we kind of had a quick conversation about this. Well, not that quick, I guess, but we had a conversation about this a couple weeks ago. Um, and so, just thinking about what we view as important in an MMM, and why you would go that direction, as opposed to some other methods that you could do to kind of attribute your sales to your media. And so just to rehash those quickly, an MMM can be a good tool to kind of isolate your different media and marketing tactics, to understand what's driving your sales. Assuming you have enough sales volume to kind of do this in a meaningful way. So really, like when we think about brands that would get value out of this, it would be typically high transaction volume brands, right? So brands that are just starting out, or kind of B2B brands where it's kind of low sales conversions, high dollar amounts, right? Like that's going to be much harder to run an MMM for, just because you're going to have less opportunity for sales instances and just variability in your data. The other thing you'd want to think about is having enough media tactics and marketing tactics where this actually kind of makes sense, right? If your brand only advertises on Meta, and only runs a Black Friday promotion every year, right? Um, you probably aren't going to get that much value out of an MMM, and you're better off doing things like kind of holdout testing and stuff like that. Um, and then lastly, just making sure you have sort of enough variability between your marketing tactics. And so if everything is always on all the time at the same level, um, an MMM probably isn't going to be able to separate those out for you. Directionally, you're going to get as much out of that as you would out of kind of last click attribution or something else, because underneath the model, um, it's not going to be able to say, okay, this drove 50% and this drove 100%, as opposed to, this drove 75%, this drove 25%, because they're always on at the same time. And so, a model would have no way of separating that out if they executed always in tandem. What you'd want to look for is, okay, we do, kind of Google more here, we do Meta more here, we do TikTok more here, and there is some kind of variability in those trends, along with kind of underlying information on your point of sale and promotion data as well. So that's kind of the quick recap of what we talked about last time.
Yeah, and on that note, actually, I have a question that we didn't really touch on before, but we sometimes there are channels or tactics that people use that are inherently more challenging to get the data on, right? So like we talked last time about why we think you should look at, or which metrics we think you should look at, right? Whether it's impressions, dollar spend, transactions, revenue, all those kind of factors. Um, but some channels and places are harder to get impression level data, right? Like if you relied on, let's say, like field sales, right, or like conferences kind of thing, right? Like you're an e-com brand, a retail brand, you're whatever, but a big portion of your go-to-market motion is going to events and having a booth and giving out samples or selling at an event. How do you is that something that you can try and back into and get like a proxy metric or get an approximation metric to still bring in, or do you have to kind of say like, hey, our MMM is only going to be able to evaluate these channels because they're easier to measure?
Yeah, I think as like part of an MMM, if you had an event like that, right, that would be something you'd want to control for definitely in the model, right? Especially if you see like
Hmm.
a measurable spike after that activity, right? And if that's the only thing you're measuring, you probably wouldn't need an MMM because you could just see like, okay, like in the immediate days following this, what happened here, and if it and unless that conference was kind of the week of Black Friday, Cyber Monday, right? You can probably isolate that relatively reasonably. Um, now, if you're doing an MMM, that's the kind of thing you would definitely want to control for in your model, right? Because you wouldn't want to attribute any sort of sales spike, related to a one-time event, to kind of your media tactics, which is what the model is going to try to do if you don't have anything else that's controlling for it. And it's fairly easy to see if you look at your sales trend line data for kind of a one-time event like that, or even like a promotion, right? Like, whereas a media tactic that you're executing over time, that would look like a more kind of gradual increase in sales as you sort of like get out there and people start to engage with your advertising. Uh,
Hmm.
as opposed to a promotion, right? Which is like, that's going to show up in your data as kind of a spike.
Yeah.
And this type of event would probably be somewhere in between that, right? Where it would kind of probably spike immediately afterward and tail off, and so not be as drastic of an up down as a promotion. But you'll see that as you trend out your data, and if you know that like that was the week that you did an event, right? the model doesn't the model's not going to say like, oh, this is a spike and therefore it's like not attributed to media. The model's going to say on average, right, when the media is running, this is the sales. And so that's going to get sort of folded into um the average effectiveness of your tactic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Interesting. That makes sense. Okay. So yeah, so it's less about using, for again, for this example, the field sales team or whatever, it's less about having that be one of the channels that you're measuring, and it's more about actually controlling for that and figuring out what that lift was and kind of removing that impact from impacting the rest of the channels that you're evaluating.
yeah, definitely. And if you did want to measure that, pretty directly, one of the things you could do is if you're giving out sort of, kind of pamphlets or something about what you want them to look into afterward, and you have, kind of a link that they can go to there, right? Like have that link be sort of siloed off.
Hmm.
And so you understand exactly all of the traffic that came there. They came there because you gave them this thing, right? Like that's one of the
Yeah.
if you're looking to isolate something like that specifically, like that's the way you'd want to do that. You'd really want to
Yeah.
understand like which of your traffic came because of this. Um,
Yeah. 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 So it'd be like, a QR code that goes to a landing page. You cookie someone, uh, so that even if they then come through Google in a different session, they're still getting tracked back through that landing page. And then you can also kind of see what the volume is. So it's not misattributing anything to Google. And you can kind of isolate on the last click side anybody who, or I guess even first click side, right? Like you build a segment in your data of anyone who touched that landing page.
yeah, exactly. Something like that. Sometimes simpler is better and often
Yeah.
cheaper.
And cheaper is not always better. Cheaper is sometimes better. Um,
Spending less money is
oh,
better. Cheaper is not
yeah,
necessarily better.
that's a good point. That's a good point. We could, I almost went with a different version of that, and we could have just kept arguing back and forth about the right way to measure cheapness versus value. All right, so let's talk about MMMs again. So, uh, anyways, the reason these guys reached out was, they've been adding channels to their mix. They've been adding spend, and they're getting to a point where it's no longer a one or two channel game, and so they are trying to figure out the impact of things like podcasts, which is harder to measure, and also often higher in the funnel, against your usual suspects of Google and Meta and stuff like that. So it was a great time for them, or great time for them to be reaching out and thinking about it. I'm glad they thought about it early in their podcast advertising and expansion timing. Um, and so they had a few vendors in mind, right? And so there's a lot of people out there who are making MMMs these days. Um, there's the old stalwarts like Nielsen, where you cut your teeth. There are SaaS platforms like Triple Whale and House and Measured and um, I mean the list kind of just goes on and on. And then there's kind of people like us who are probably closer to the Nielsen side, but significantly cheaper. And since we just heard that cheaper or less expensive is better, therefore we're better than Nielsen. Um, but let's talk about like these SaaS MMMs and not picking on any one of them, but like conceptually, like I don't know, I kind of have an issue with the idea of like subscribing to an MMM. Like, what do you think about the idea of like paying for access to it versus paying for a report itself or paying for a model itself or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at it. One is the question of whether or not you need an MMM on an ongoing basis or you need one, right? And if you're a brand that's like sort of constantly changing your media strategy, right? Like constantly turning on and off different media channels or, kind of changing the relative execution of each of them, right? That's when you'd want to have something that really kind of tracks it kind of very regularly and over time, right? To just make sure that your effectiveness levels are staying where you think they're staying with your shifting strategies, right? Um, and you're able to kind of get significant reads on the variability of what you're actually measuring, right? And so your tactics aren't changing enough where that measurement is going to be kind of meaningful. Um, but that said, if you're seeing the same reading, kind of from week to week, month to month, this is the effectiveness of this channel, and it just changes, as you kind of increase or decrease it, right? And you're not looking at things like, like saturation, or you're not like testing to see how high you can go and like where those diminishing returns are and something like that, right? Like you don't need to see this every week. What you need to understand is like, okay, here is how this has performed and here's how I should expect it to perform. And then you should refresh it, right? Like quarterly or biannually or when you make major changes, right? Because I think it's easy to just get caught up in like, oh, I need to be seeing this, on a constant basis without thinking about like, okay, but are you doing anything differently with that data, right? Do you need to be seeing this often? Because the data and insights are great, but to the extent that they're not actually helping you make decisions, right? It's your time is better spent elsewhere. And so, that's kind of my perspective on, when you would want this on a recurring basis. Now, when you might,
And I want to stop there for a second, because like it's also like you said strategic change, and I think that's an important thing to highlight, right? Like we're not talking about I'm changing the creative and I'm testing creative differences on Meta. It's not about um, you know, like it is truly higher level strategic changes or new channel additions or significant changes in budget, right? Like we're not talking about day-to-day optimizations of how do I make my meta ads perform better? Which of these two meta ads is working better? If you're still optimizing for the same event, if you're still using the same general channel mix, if you're only lightly ramping up spend, like I just don't think that an MMM is the right tool for your day-to-day, week-to-week optimizations, right? Like I think those really should come from your ad platforms and from maybe your maybe you have like a Heidi how do you hear about a survey? Um, like those kind of things I think are more day to day. And then I think of the MMM as like the higher level. Okay, let's sit and talk about a quarter. Let's talk about this half year, something like that. Like is right? Like, am I missing
yeah,
something here?
I would say that the built-in platform attributions, right, for something like you're running a new creative, is probably going to be as valuable or more valuable than an MM in that case. Because whether or not you think, Meta is over attributing your sales to Meta, right? If you change your creative and Meta says, okay, this is now working 25% better, regardless of what that baseline is, that's already going to give you probably a more accurate reading on that, right? You're like, okay, I need to establish what my perspective on the baseline was, right? And how much meta is over attributing. Um, but the relative impact of that is probably going to be more impactful than what you're going to get out of an MMM, right? And so to your point, like strategic changes, what I mean by that is you're saying, okay, we don't think search is working as well for us. Let's just like completely flood meta here and like see the point that we can get to saturation at, right? And like that's where the MMM is going to be really valuable because if you're all of a sudden saying like, let's increase our meta advertising by 2x, right? Are you still then getting the same sales per impression that you were getting before, right? And that's a really important question to answer, and that's what MMM can do if you make changes like that, where you're going to say like, okay, our sales did go up, but we increased execution by 2x, and our meta driven sales increased by 1.7x, right? Like that's a really valuable insight to know. That's something that MMM can help you with, in sort of a a very strategic overall execution context. So that would be my thought there. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah,
Good
I agree
clarification.
with that. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the other thing would be like if you think we're still talking about you and you are changing spend drastically from Google to Meta and then Meta to TikTok and then TikTok to Google without having seen your data, I'm going to go ahead and say stop. Like you don't need to be doing knee-jerk reactions all the time. Uh, and so like again, I think if you are shutting down a channel and moving and like doubling spend another channel and doing that consistently, I think we should probably just go back to reevaluating the strategy as a whole. And again, like I said, yeah, that's MMM refresh time, but at the same time, it's just like these weekly, monthly changes are should not be strategic level changes.
Agree. Yeah, and that's getting back to our point where we'd say like, okay, the most valuable iteration of the MMM you're going to run is the first time, right? Because that's going to give you a read and information that you haven't seen before.
Right.
Um, and then as you make significant changes it's like okay, like let's see how, like let's do this for a month and then like kind of reboot this up and kind of run it a few times and see where it what we're seeing on effectiveness. um and it's sort of a more business as usual maintenance mode, right? Like let's run this quarterly, biannually, and see if there's like anything changing about how people are interacting with our media, right? And
Yeah.
so to that end, right, we talked about like do you need to be looking at this every day or every week? Like, do you need to be paying a subscription for it? It's I think for most brands, no, you probably don't. And that's probably going to lead to some, just general analysis paralysis, and not really making meaningful decisions based on it. But more importantly, is for any of these MMMs that don't give you actual access to the underlying model, right? You need to make sure you own it. You can't be handcuffed to, kind of we have to quit a subscription and now all of a sudden like everything we have is gone. Like you should have a very easy way of turning an MMM into a scenario planning and a media buying plan, right? And so being able to turn this into a, into like a very simple even spreadsheet that says I'm planning to spend this much and I'm going to get this many impressions and this is how many sales like I think this will drive. And you know, it's not as flashy, but it's how decisions are actually made, right? Like you need to be able to turn that data into decisions, into scenario planning, and be able to kind of iterate on that. Um, so that would be, kind of my other overall watch out is like this model needs to be something you own. And it really can't be like a black box where it's just like here's an output and trust me, and you can't use that output actually for anything. Um, and so that's just something to watch out when picking a platform as well.
Yeah, and I think that is the closest to justification for the SaaS approach that I've seen is right like um, one that I worked with before and I do like the team. I think they're brilliant. Um, they would give you this forecasting tool in the app, and then they would, after you run a scenario, a prediction, you would execute your media plan against that, and then it would test against its prediction and would use that to improve its predictions going forward, right? And so like that
Mhm.
is okay, now we're talking about something interesting where it's not just analysis of previous spend. It is actually what you're actually paying for, in my opinion, with that is a forecasting tool, right? And how do we get better at forecasting? So potentially there, you could convince me that this can be a subscription. I would argue that at some point, it's not going to just continuously get better at prediction to the point where it's like 99% right. And so at some point, you should basically be able to be like, okay, great, model's set for now. Like, we don't need to just keep spending 15, 20K a month with you. And when we do make this next change or every year, so it's almost like if you're paying a SaaS version, to me it should be like an annual price, and it should not be something on the order of uh, you know 200K or something like that per year, or 15, 20K per month. Like, yes, they're valuable tools. So like if you're doing value-based pricing, maybe you are getting $200,000 worth of value out of it. But I just fundamentally think that it shouldn't cost that much money. And you shouldn't have to pay every month for a tool that you lose access to all the data when you stop paying.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, and what else? So we've talked about who should use it. We've talked about why you should get access to the underlying model itself. We've talked about how cheap I am. We've talked about how it kind of fits in, right? Like the triangulation approach we talk about all the time of the how'd you hear about a survey paired with a media mix model, paired with, you know, like the more you can layer on attribution techniques, the better, right? So like do
Mhm.
geo holdout tests in addition to last click and first touch, in addition to how do you hear about us, in addition to a media mix model, right? Like all of these are some shade of the truth. And so the more perspectives we can get, kind of where this overlap is going to be closer to the actual truth. Each of them limited by how they measure in the data they have access to or you have access to. What else? Like why you mentioned something interesting of like the most valuable one is the first one. And so I think that's an important thing to touch on our approach, right? So like when we build media mix models, we charge more for the first model. Um, A, because it's more work, B, because it drives more value, and C, because potentially like you could be good there, right? Like you now have this model, you might be good for a year. Um, and so you should be, capturing most of that value. And then refreshes fundamentally just are not as much work, nor arguably as much value, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think like the first iteration is the most valuable because it's telling you things you don't know yet, right? And so yeah, and depending on how often you're kind of doing your media planning, right? Like you would need a tool for that, and then you kind of do your media planning and you execute against it, and maybe you need to refresh the next time that you go to do that, but before you then go to kind of change your media strategy, you probably wouldn't need another one unless something's going wrong and you need to make a fix. And so that's kind of the primary point. The second is like it's unlikely that you'd see kind of drastic changes without drastic changes in execution or market conditions um, between when you first see the output of an MMM and when you check it again, right? Like from there, it's really just going to kind of move incrementally, right? And so you'd want to stay on top of it. You'd want to be making decisions with the most up to date information possible. But again, like at the point that you're actually making that decision, that's when it's important to see a refresh. And like you said, the refresh just fundamentally isn't as much work, right? Like there's not as much underlying like technical stuff to do, kind of data cleaning and normalization and data gathering, right? Like you've after the first one got all of your data together, and the maintenance of that is easier than the setup. And so it is a high upfront cost, but that's where most of the value comes from. Um, so that's kind of our perspective there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a pretty solid point, right? So like again, what we the way we approach it, um, we build you a model, you get the model. Refreshes are at your discretion. We recommend at the very least annually, um, and they're substantially cheaper. Um, and then the times you should do more frequent updates are if you are significantly changing your strategy and looking at you add new channels, you're running some significant testing, right? And so like an example of a time that uh, I heard about was if you have ever listened to the Numbers and Narratives podcast that I have, we talk
Oh.
to EJ White at Beehive. Beehive uses a tool called Blue Alpha for their media mix model. They launched their first out of home campaign, and so they measured that. And obviously that required a new model because they added an entire new channel. And then because they saw it work, then they started trying to iterate on it, right? And so suddenly now it's not just significant changes um, in like strategy, but it's also they were dialing down and running tests in different markets and wanted to see the cumulative lift of an out of home campaign, which is inherently very, very hard to measure. And so they did use a lot of updates to a media mix model because they were constantly changing formats, locations, all that. That is a time where, okay, this is probably your best measurement tool, and that made a lot of sense. And so, you know, Peter and the team at Blue Alpha are building something really cool. Maybe that's the right tool for you if you're doing those sorts of things. If you aren't doing that sort of thing, though, um, then it really probably is not something you need to have running at all times. And so you're basically paying you're just paying it on like a loan basis, right? Like you don't even own the model. You are paying every single month to get an output that you should use quarterly or semi-annually or annually. And so you're just deferring cost, but ultimately you're paying, a couple $100,000 annually for the same model.
Yeah, and I think a very simple like rule of thumb test, right, is like, okay, you're getting these outputs regularly, like you're paying a monthly subscription. Are you using the outputs regularly, right? Like, are you actually using it regularly? And if the answer is no, and you used it just at the start, then that's what you really want to be paying for, right? You could apply that to any tool at all, right? Like, are you using this regularly to make decisions, right? Because a lot of times it's just like, okay, here's a lot of like cool analysis and insights. Um, but if they're not driving business decisions, you're not really using it, right? You're just
Right.
you're just looking at it. And so, you know, for all of your data analysis tools, think about like, are you just looking at it or are you making decisions on it, right? And that's a good rule for MMMs too, right? Where you don't need to be paying a subscription for something you're not regularly using to make decisions.
All right. I think we beat this one to death, man. Um, Everyone, MMMs are great. Consider it. Don't rush to it. Make smart choices. If you want to talk to us, shoot us a note.
Thanks all.